Hey, Ignition, how are we doing? Awesome. It is so good to be back. And so we are continuing this Faith Under the Scope series. It's actually our last one where we know and where we believe that we have a God who reveals himself to us and also a God who is not afraid of our questions. And so we're doing a Q&A tonight with the one, the only, Reverend Dr. Keep adding to list, Your Majesty, Caroline. So everyone say, welcome. It's finals, so they're a bit tired.
I understand finals. I've taken more finals than you all have even thought about.
Awesome. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly a bit?
Absolutely. I am Caroline Boehnke-Becker, and I, just to let you know, I've been around hope, big hope, forever. Literally, my family and I came when there were 20 people at worship, and Pastor Mike was still reading his sermons off a legal pad. So we have been here for over 30 years. So it is really, really, really cool to see what God has done in a really short period of time. I am a physician. I am an OBGYN, which means I take care of women who are pregnant, and I do surgery and all that good stuff. And so went to medical school and all that good stuff. And I also went to seminary and was a pastor at Hope West Des Moines for a long time.
Yeah, and you've retired, right? So you don't do stuff anymore?
Yeah, no, I rather than having two jobs, I decided one job was enough. And so I have stepped back from Hope, and I'm still practicing medicine, at least for now anyway. We'll see what happens next.
Yeah, we're so lucky to have Pastor Caroline with us here tonight. And so we're going to dive right into the questions. So there were over 50 questions asked, so we're not getting to all of them, but what we kind of did is we grouped them into categories to try and cover as many questions as possible. So the first question is, what are the limits of science and faith? What can they and what can't they do?
I think this question comes from a place of, can I be a Christian and also understand science? Because that is a huge argument now in our culture, which in my mind is kind of silly, given the fact that I'm both a scientist and a pastor. And I promise you I'm not schizophrenic. Here's the deal. What people don't understand. It is my contention that we here in the United States are both biblically and scientifically illiterate, which means we don't know what science is supposed to do, what lane science is supposed to run in, and we don't know what lane faith is supposed to run in. Because there are different ways of knowing truth, okay? So how does science understand truth? How does science uncover truth? Well, it uses logic. It uses experiments. It uses questions and says, if this is true, I need to prove that it is by doing an experiment. And that experiment needs to be replicable. In other words, you need to be able to do the same experiment and get the same results every time. That's how we know that the answer that we get to the question that we have is right, okay? So that's how science works. So science is working about the physical world, the natural world. And we're using our senses, our eyes, our ears, our touch, all of those senses to be able to understand how the world actually works, okay? Chemistry, physics, biology, everything that you guys have been studying in school, okay? That's science, and there's a certain method behind how science works, okay? Now, science is not the only way to know truth, all right? You can know truth, you can know truth about history. And history, you can't replicate. You can't do an experiment and think the same thing's going to happen again and again, because history happened once and for all. So with history, you have to go back and look at the original documents. You read newspaper stories, you read diaries, you do all of those kinds of things, and that's how history figures out truth. That's how history answers questions. Now, faith is another way of knowing. And the way we understand in faith is that there is a source, there is a revelation that we believe comes from an authority. In Christian faith, we believe the authority is God. We believe it comes to us through the Holy Spirit, and that God has given us the Bible in order to understand who he is and who we are to be in the world. Okay? Now, that faith is in Christianity, it is in Judaism, it is in Hinduism, it is in Islam. Each of those different faiths have a different source, different revelation for their truth. Okay? So, what science cannot tell you, for instance, it cannot tell you whether the music of Beyonce is better than the music of Bach. Okay? It just doesn't work that way. And you can't ask faith what the dates of the Civil War are. So you have to understand what questions science is meant to answer and what questions faith is meant to answer. Science is meant to answer the how and the when. Faith is meant to answer purpose and guidance. And so we've got to be careful that we ask science the questions it was meant to answer and ask faith the questions it was meant to answer. And if you try to cross them up, that's where we get into big trouble.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love how you said, like, there's different ways of knowing. And even, like, a lot of people say, oh, I have a scientific brain. It's just like, well, how do you know your friend? How do you know your parents or someone like that? And just, like, there are these different ways. And so we need to kind of put them in their proper categories. That's awesome.
And the other thing that sometimes Christians get a little bit leery about, a little bit nervous about, well, if science says this, but what about what God says? Here's the deal. All truth, if it's truth, it's God's truth. So whether that truth comes to you through historical inquiry, something like that, or if it comes through a relationship, or if it comes through science, if it's true, it's God's truth.
God's not afraid of science. He actually made it, so it works out well. Awesome. So question number 2, we got a lot on these ones. So this is a big one. Everyone's on the edge of their seats. How do you explain dinosaurs and evolution in light of the Bible? So an easy one.
Really, actually it is. When you recognize what questions can you ask science and what questions can you ask faith, you realize you cannot ask the Bible where dinosaurs came from. Because what is the question about dinosaurs? Is how and when. The Bible is meant to tell us who and why. Let's just take Genesis 1 and 2, the 2 creation stories. You all know that there are 2 creation stories, right? There's not just one. There are 2 creation stories. Genesis chapter 1 is the first creation story. That's the one, in the beginning God said, let there be light, and there was, and all of those things. Second creation story is when we are introduced to Adam and Eve. They are 2 separate creation stories. Okay? How many of you knew that already? So everybody learned a little something tonight.
I mean, if they were here 2 weeks ago, they would have learned that.
Oh, excellent. So. Okay, so we know this is a sneaky way to take attendance. So, the way you have to look at the Bible is ask, what is the Bible trying to tell us? What truth is God trying to give us through the Bible? And recognize that the Bible was written about 3,000 or so more years ago. Okay? And at that time in history, a lot of cultures, all cultures, have some kind of creation story, some kind of way to explain how we got here. And at the time that God called his people, these creation stories that were around the chosen people of Israel were like, okay, well, there are a whole bunch of gods, and the gods got into a huge fight, and the female goddess lost, and so the god who won cut her body in half, and the top half he made the heavens, and the bottom half he made the earth. Okay? That is one of the creation stories at the time that the Bible was given to us. Well, when you read Genesis 1, what does it say? It says that there weren't lots of gods and goddesses. There was one God. And creation wasn't because there was a giant war and somebody lost. It was God created using his all-powerful word. And he created it so that human beings could flourish, and most importantly, in the first Genesis creation story in Genesis 1, Human beings are the pinnacle, the top of creation, which means we are meant to be in a relationship with God. So the first creation story tells us who created God and why, because he wants to be in a relationship with us. The second creation story with Adam and Eve says this is how close the relationship God wants to have with us. Genesis chapter 1 is God says, let us create humans in our image. In our image, let us create them. Male and female, he created them. In Genesis chapter 2, he says, let's talk about Adam and Eve. Let's get personal. And let's really understand what it's like to be in this relationship. Has nothing to do with how did God create. Because that's not the responsibility of the Bible. That's not what the Bible was given to us for. The Bible was given to us so that we knew that we were created out of love to be in a relationship with a God who continues to want to be in a relationship with us. Now, evolution says, okay, but I wonder, how did we all get here? What are these dinosaurs? How do things evolve? How do things change? And so that's what science and evolution is telling us. It's the how and the when, not the why. So science is answering those questions, not the questions of who created, because that's not science's responsibility. Nor is it the Bible's responsibility to say how God created. And when people get nervous about that, I have these arguments all the time, so I could talk about this for literally 3 hours. But when people get nervous about that, when Christians get nervous about that, saying, well, if it's not 6 24-hour days, which actually when you read the Hebrew it isn't, but whatever, if it can't be 6 24-hour days, then that means God's really small. I'm thinking, really? Isn't your God big enough to create using evolution? And the scientists who say, oh, it could never be 6 days. But wait, isn't your God big enough if he chose to create in 6 24-hour days? Otherwise, gosh, I think your God's pretty small. And I think you need to relook at who your God is.
That's good. I think how big we see God being challenges both our faith and our science as well. And we try to limit him in the box, but
All
doesn't
the
usually work
time.
out.
Exactly.
And I think one of the difficulties that a lot of people have with evolution is if you say like, oh, come from a fish to a human being, and then we hear this concept of the image of God. And those can almost seem like they're in these different categories, which in many ways we're talking about they are. But so the third question is, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And is that scientific? Is that something that science can even speak to?
Science really doesn't speak to it because remember, it's the when and why, and the when and how, okay? The Bible teaches us that we were made in the image of God. Again, so to counter all of those weird creation myths that were happening around the time, okay? Number one, and number two, because there's a lot to be said. Being created in the image of God means we do not have to have idols. We don't have to make little gods to worship because we are the image of God. At the time of the weird creation stories, how did people worship? Well, they made images of God. And they were, animals and all, bulls and all that kind of thing. Okay? When God created, he says, we are his image. You don't need to worship something else because we are in the image of God. And so what is the image of God? It's not what he looks like. That sometimes people get a little concerned about. Then, gosh, if it's evolution, then did God look like this before? That's not, it has nothing to do with appearance. It has to do with character. What is the image of God? First of all, he's creative. I mean, the entire first chapter of the Bible is how creative he is. And he's loving. He created out of love. You get into chapter 3 of Genesis, you find out God is forgiving. He cares for his creation. We read through the Bible, you realize he is a God of justice, that we should be treated the way we expect to be treated. He's also a God of mercy. and he treats us better than the way that we should be treated. God is intelligent. He is rational. He is logical. He is ultimately seen in Jesus. So when you want to know what being made in the image of God is, look at how Jesus was when he was here on earth. He had friends. He enjoyed a good party. He cried when he was sad. He got angry. He was in relationship with people. It mattered to him how people were treated. It really mattered to him how the outcast, how the people who were on the margins, how they were being treated. And Jesus really cared about how the religious people acted. So if you want to know what the image of God is, look at who Jesus is. And that's what we are supposed to model ourselves after.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it reminds me of the second commandment, to not use the Lord's name in vain, and how there's been a lot of different new research of saying actually means by how we live our lives, how we image God in the world is what that's really talking about, not just what words we say.
Yeah, words is only a little piece of how we behave. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's time to get deep. So if God created everything perfect, why is there pain and suffering and sin and bad things in the world?
I love this. This is just chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Genesis. So Genesis 1 and 2, God created, it was fabulous. And then we get to Genesis 3. We get to Genesis 3 and we realize, looking back at Genesis 2, God created this amazing garden for his people to live in. And he said, you can eat of everything in the garden. We have no idea how big it was, but I'm guessing it was huge. And it was gorgeous, and it had everything that Adam and Eve needed to be able to have a joy-filled life. And God just said, the only thing I don't want you to do, one tree, stay away from one tree. So we get to Genesis 3, and Satan encounters Adam and Eve, and what does Satan do? He said, did God really say? God's holding out on you. God's not a God of abundance. He's a God of scarcity. He doesn't want you to know the knowledge of good and evil, because then you would be like God. You may be made in the image of God, but not quite. And so you're just not good enough. And so therefore, God's holding out on you. And Adam and Eve fell for it. And they said, you know what? I want to be like God. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil was saying, God, I don't want you to tell me what is good and what is evil, what I should do and what I shouldn't do. I want to decide that. And ever since then, evil has come into the world because we want to be our little g gods. We want to choose what's good and what's bad. We want to choose how to live our lives rather than living our life in the image of God. And so when you're living in a world like that, why do bad things happen? Well, because there's sin in the world, okay? Your sin, my sin, and just the crazy, messed up world that we have. And the easiest way to think about that is, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, sometimes it's because I sin. You know, if I'm going through an intersection and I run a red light and I get T-boned, well, duh, that was because I screwed up. That's why bad things happened to me. That was my sin. Maybe it was somebody else running a red light and I get T-boned. And I am hurt because of somebody else's sin. And there are just some things that happen because we live in a fallen world, because the world is messed up and it is not the world that God created us to live in. And so why is there pain and suffering? Because we screw up, because other people screw up, and because the world is screwed up. Good thing is that God didn't leave us to live in a screwed up world. And he sent Jesus to be able to turn everything right side up again. It doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but we know that on the other side of whatever suffering or whatever pain or anything like that, we know that God is walking with us, that we have somebody on our side, that we are not alone, regardless of what the pain is, and that regardless of what happens here now today, there is another day where God is going to be there holding us up.
That's good. If you're on the Ignition Leadership Team, you know I have a love-hate relationship with the Q&As because, like, one, that's a perfect answer to this. And there's also times where it's just like, man, I'm not asking this for my head, but I'm asking it for my heart. And that where pain and sin and brokenness, suffering, death aren't these things, are these concepts up in the air, but they're actually something that we've been through. And one of my favorite theologians, his name's Jürgen Moltmann, he says, in the Bible, in Jesus, we don't always find the answer, but we do find the answerer. That in that place of hurt, in that place of sin, of grief, that there's a God who's not just up there in the heavens, but one who's sitting next to us and says, yeah, sometimes the world sucks too. And he's not okay with the brokenness of the world. He says, I'm in the business of making it right again. And so it's really difficult to have these questions because, yeah, sometimes we think we want the answer for our heads, but actually we need the love of our Heavenly Father for our hearts as well. And that kind of brings us into our last question for the night of how does your faith impact how you handle difficult medical situations?
Well, I'm one of those weird people who right before I go into an exam room or do surgery or something like that, I always send up a really quick prayer. And it's always, Lord God, guide me. Because I know that I'm not the healer. I am a physician, little p, and I'm working for the great physician, capital P. And so I look at myself as I need to be Jesus' presence, his hands, his feet, his voice, in whatever situation I'm working in. So if there is, doing OB, one of the worst things you ever have to do is to tell a couple that they've had their baby is stillborn. That just sucks beyond belief. There's nothing worse. There is nothing worse than being in a delivery room when it's quiet. And in those times, I have to lean on being able to say to patients and their families, I am so sorry. I don't understand. Even though I don't understand, I'm going to be here with you. I'm not going to walk away. I'm going to sit with the questions. I'm going to give you as many answers as I possibly can. But I can't change it, but I can be with you in this path, on this journey. And the only way I can do that is knowing that Jesus has got my back. Because without that deep core understanding that Jesus is crying right along with all of us, I couldn't do this job. I'd go code. I mean, who cares if the code doesn't work, Because I know the love of Jesus and because I know I want to give that to others, part of doing what I do, in most of the time, it's the highest of highs. There's nothing better than delivering a baby. It is the coolest thing in the world. But sometimes it's the lowest of lows. And everybody can do the highs. But it's in the lows that I lean really, really hard on my faith, because it would be hard to go to work the next day if I didn't.
Yeah. As a good amount of y'all know, this last summer I was a chaplain in a hospital, and so chaplains are kind of the awkward people. We're like, we're not the physicians. Like we don't do anything like in that way. But we are those who are present in the most difficult times. And so I've been there at the times where people have died and been sitting with their families and been there at the sharing of the news, or just when you thought life was going to go one day and all changed. And it actually brings me back to our second question, is our God big enough? Is our God big enough that when the brokenness and the hurt and the pain of the sin in this world comes directly to our face, that when we don't have a direct answer for that the hope can sustain us, that the resurrection can sustain us. Is our hope big enough to push our faith further than it's ever gone before, to push our understanding of this world and of science and those things further than it's gone before? Say, God, even if I don't have every answer, God, even if I'm numb to everything that's going on in this world, that I know you love me, I know that you are here, and that's enough for now. So everyone, let's thank Pastor Caroline.